Happy Passover, everybody. I hope you all had a wonderful first half of Passover, and I hope it's continuing to be great. And I'm sure your Seder's were different but special. Ours were. And there was a lot of good discussion at the Seder. And one of the topics that came up that we talked about were these four sons, this iconic part of the Haggadah that discusses the four sons. One is a wise one is a wicked son, and so on and so forth. And I shared with everybody something that I remember reading years ago, that one way of understanding these four sons is to see them as successive generations of Jewish people in exile. So we know just briefly the history of the Jewish people is that as we've been wandering for the last 2,000 years, we've been accepted into certain countries, whether it was England or France or Germany or Russia, for a period of time. And typically what would happen is the Jewish people would quickly rise to prominence and success in that community, in that culture. And then for some reason, they would be expelled after usually pogroms and some kind of violent response. And one of the reasons for this is because built into the system of history and into the reality of the Jewish people is a promise that God gave to Abraham that we would remain his special people throughout all of time. But there's a danger and there's a problem that when we become successful and we begin to integrate and assimilate into the cultures that we live in during the exile, the last 2,000 years, there's a very distinct possibility of assimilation. So in order to make sure that we don't assimilate, there's built into this fabric of reality this anti-Semitism that eventually turns on us and somehow prevents us from becoming too completely assimilated. So if you think about that, usually what happens is a generation comes from the old country to the new country. That's the generation of the wise son, because that generation still knows about Judaism. They retain the history, the traditions, the observance, the practices. They're still, let's say, payas wearing, black hat, Orthodox old country Jews. And then what happens is the second generation, the generation of the wicked son, is the one who says, hey, what do we need these old customs and these old traditions for? We want to be a part of this new culture and this new society that we're in. And if we dressed like they dressed in the old country, we're going to be ridiculed and it's going to be terrible. So what do? They rebel against the parents' generation. They rebel against the traditions, the observances, and they make an effort to try to assimilate. What's the third generation? Third generation is the children of those people who are the simple son. They're maybe vaguely familiar with their traditions. They remember their grandparents and going to a Passover Seder with their grandparents. They don't like it. They don't dislike it. It's just part of their life. The fourth generation is this generation, the Einoli Yodei Lishol, the generation that doesn't even know how to ask anymore, because they've become so assimilated, the fourth generation, that they don't even know the questions. They're unfamiliar with the traditions completely and entirely. And important to recognize is that in the Haggadah, there is no fifth son. There's no fifth child. And the reason for that is because typically by the fifth generation, what has happened is that the assimilation has been so successful that that fifth generation person doesn't even recognize anymore, realize or identify themselves as being Jewish, and they're not present at the Seder. Which is why if you ever sit in a room with a large number of Jews and you ask them the question, how many people in this room have a grandparent or at least a great-grandparent that was observant, that observed Judaism and the halacha and the traditions, almost everybody will raise their hand. Because if they can't go back 3 generations, if they have to go back 4 or more generations before there is someone who is observant, they wouldn't be in that group of people identifying themselves as Jewish people. This is the assimilation process as it has had its negative and devastating effect on the Jewish people throughout exile, throughout the generations of exile, in particular in this country, in America. It was once said by a great rabbi that it was more difficult to be a Jew. It's more difficult to be a Jew in suburbia than it was in Siberia, than it was to be a Jew in Siberia. And if you think about that, it's ironic, but it's probably true. Because the ease of assimilation and the ease of acculturation in suburbia is very powerful. So we have to recognize that and know that our role as parents, as grandparents, is to infuse as much Yiddishkeit, as much tradition, as much Judaism, as much observance, as much excitement as possible for our children, so that their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren will always be at the Seder. We don't want our generations to be that fifth son. Something to keep in mind and discuss as we continue through Passover. Have a great day, everybody.